You know, sometimes in life the very thing people mock you for becomes the weapon that turns your entire story around. I was once told I was too honest, that my mouth had no filter, that I should just nod and play along, even when I knew something was wrong. But let me ask you, why should anyone settle for pretending, especially when you can see the flaws that everyone else is too afraid to point out? That so-called weakness of mine, that bluntness that cost me my job, became the exact reason I ended up sitting in the CEO chair of the very same company that had kicked me out. Sounds crazy, right? Let me take you back to where it all started. Because this isn't just about revenge or success, it's about how standing firm in your truth, even when it burns bridges, can light the path to a destiny you never imagined. 3 years before I signed the documents to buy the company outright, I was just another mid-level manager sitting in a cramped office with flickering lights, trying to convince myself that keeping my mouth shut was the way to survive. But that's not who I am. And it was on one unforgettable Monday morning meeting that everything began to unravel. The boss, a man who loved hearing his own voice more than listening to reason, announced a project launch date that was flat out impossible. Everyone around the table nodded like obedient bobbleheads, but my stomach churned. I raised my hand, cleared my throat, and said what nobody else dared to. This timeline will break the team. It's not realistic. We'll burn people out and still miss the deadline. The room went silent, eyes darted, and I felt the temperature drop. My so-called honesty had just signed my professional death warrant. Within weeks, I was labeled negative, not a team player, and then came the infamous HR call. They told me the company valued positivity and alignment. What they really meant was they valued silence and compliance. I walked out with a box of my things, my pride intact, but my career in pieces. At least, that's what it looked like to everyone else. But what they didn't know was that in firing me for honesty, they had just set me on the path to becoming their biggest nightmare and later, their boss. Because honesty doesn't just reveal problems, it exposes opportunities. And when you learn how to turn rejection into fuel, doors start opening in the most unexpected ways. After walking out of that glass building with my box of belongings, I remember the sting in my chest more than the weight in my arms. It wasn't just the loss of a paycheck, it was the humiliation. Colleagues who used to smile at me avoided eye contact as if I had caught some contagious disease called unemployed. The worst part, they all whispered later that I had been right about the timeline. The project failed spectacularly, employees quit in frustration, and millions were lost. But instead of learning from it, the leadership doubled down on blaming negativity in the ranks. I became a cautionary tale. Don't be like him. Don't rock the boat. That bitterness stayed with me for months. At first, I drowned it in late-night ramen and job rejection emails. I would scroll endlessly through job postings, only to find every description filled with the same fake smiles of team synergy and aligned culture. It felt like every company wanted clones, not thinkers. But there's something strange about hitting rock bottom. It clears your view of everything else. When you've been stripped of what you thought defined you, you start seeing yourself in sharper focus. And for me, that meant realizing I wasn't built to nod along in someone else's boardroom. If my honesty was poison to them, maybe it was a cure for something else. I started freelancing, consulting small businesses that were desperate for someone to tell them the truth without sugarcoating it. And you know what? They loved it. A local hardware supplier told me, "No one has ever just said it like it is. You saved me thousands." Another small bakery owner hugged me after I told her that her business partner was bleeding her dry and needed to go. I was shocked at how much people valued blunt truth when it wasn't being weaponized against them, but used to help them grow. Slowly, I started building a reputation. My phone buzzed more often, not with job rejections, but with referrals. One day, I caught myself smiling while drafting an invoice. The guy who once begged HR not to fire him, was now charging people for the very thing that had gotten me fired: honesty. Still, the scars were there. Every time I passed by the old office building, a fire burned in my gut. That company, with its smug executives and shallow values, had taught me my most painful lesson. And deep down, a thought began to form, a thought so wild I almost laughed it off. What if, one day, I didn't just succeed outside of them, but I came back and took it all? That seed was small then, but seeds grow, and mine had just landed in the right soil. As my consulting gigs grew, so did my confidence. Within a year, I wasn't just taking on small businesses anymore. I was advising mid-sized firms that couldn't afford the lies. Their employees fed them just to stay in good graces with the boss. My name began to circulate in circles I never thought I'd touch, and with that came money, real money. But more than money, it brought a sense of purpose. I wasn't just surviving after being fired. I was thriving by doing the very thing they had told me would ruin me. The irony wasn't lost on me. Yet in the back of my mind, the thought of that company, the one that had cut me down and branded me as a liability, never left. Every time I read about their financial missteps, every time I heard about another batch of employees quitting, I felt a strange mixture of vindication and hunger. Their downfall became my silent motivator. I started studying their patterns, analyzing every annual report, every leadership shift, every PR stunt. I saw their weaknesses clearer than anyone else because I had once sat in their meetings and watched those flaws firsthand. I knew the cracks in their foundation because I had been the one pointing them out before being silenced. By the second year, I had built a small but loyal team around me, people who shared my philosophy of radical transparency. They weren't yes men, they challenged me, they argued with me, but we always landed on truth, and that became our strength. Clients trusted us because we didn't waste time sugarcoating. Slowly, I transitioned from a solo consultant to running a firm of my own. We weren't huge, but we were profitable, and more importantly, we were respected. Then came the turning point. One of my clients, ironically, a former supplier of my old company, called me with a curious opportunity. He said, "You know, they're struggling. Their stock is plummeting. Investors are nervous. If someone smart enough steps in, they could take control." My heart pounded in my chest as I heard those words. For months, I had entertained the fantasy of owning them, but now here was a window reel, tangible, open. Still, the idea felt too big, too insane. I mean, who was I? Just a guy who had been tossed out like trash a couple of years ago. But then I thought about it differently. Who better than me? Who knew their weaknesses like I did? Who had more reason to fix what was broken? Suddenly, the impossible didn't seem so impossible. I started quietly moving pieces into place, saving aggressively, seeking partners, pitching investors with a fire in my voice that even surprised me. I didn't tell many people, not even my closest friends, because I knew they'd think I'd lost my mind. But every late night, every contract signed, every small victory was another brick laid on the path back to that company's front door. And deep down, I made myself a promise. If I ever got the chance, I wouldn't just take the company, I'd rebuild it into everything it was afraid to be when they pushed me out. The third year was the year everything shifted. By then, my consulting firm wasn't just a side hustle. It was a force that people in the industry had begun to notice. We were signing contracts with bigger clients, and my team had grown into a family that thrived on accountability and truth. What used to be a one-man rebellion had transformed into a company that breathed life into others by refusing to lie. That's when I got the call that still gives me chills when I think about it. An investment group I had been networking with for months reached out and said, "We've been following your work. We believe in your approach. If you're serious about taking over your old company, we're ready to back you." I remember sitting in my small office, barely bigger than a storage closet, staring at the phone in disbelief. The moment I had secretly fantasized about while eating cheap takeout and drafting invoices at midnight was suddenly standing at my doorstep. The due diligence process was brutal. I combed through every detail of their financials, seeing just how deep the rot went. Mismanaged projects, bloated executive perks, short-term decisions that killed long-term potential. It was all there. Every single thing I had warned them about years ago. And each page I turned only fueled me more. This wasn't just business anymore. This was poetic justice. Still, it wasn't easy. There were nights I lay awake, terrified I was biting off more than I could chew. Buying a company wasn't like winning a fight in the office. It meant millions of dollars. It meant risk. It meant stepping into a storm most people would run away from. But then I'd remember the day they shoved a termination letter into my hands and told me my honesty was a liability. That memory became my anchor. Every fear I had was crushed under the weight of that humiliation, because nothing could be scarier than living the rest of my life wondering what if. Slowly, the deal began to take shape. Investors signed, contracts were drafted, and negotiations started. Some of their executives looked shocked when my name appeared at the table, like seeing a ghost they thought they'd buried years ago. I kept my composure, but inside, my heart was roaring. They had no idea how long I had been preparing for this moment. 3 years of building, bleeding, and refusing to let go of my principles, all of it was about to pay off. And when the final agreement was placed before me, I signed it with a smile so calm that it almost frightened them. The same honesty that had once gotten me fired had now bought me the keys to the very empire that had tried to erase me. The day I walked into that office, as the new owner, is etched into my memory like a scar turned into a medal. The same glass doors that had once closed behind me as security escorted me out now opened automatically, almost bowing in recognition. Employees whispered my name, some in disbelief, some in awe. The executives, those who had mocked me, those who had smiled coldly as HR pushed me out, now had to stand when I entered the room. And let me tell you, nothing felt more satisfying than looking them in the eyes, calm and steady, knowing they had underestimated the one thing they couldn't buy: integrity. But here's the twist. You might think I came back breathing fire, ready to settle scores, ready to humiliate them as they had humiliated me. The truth: I didn't need to. Their own failures had done that already. Instead, I focused on rebuilding the company, stripping away the toxic culture that punished truth and rewarded silence. I created an environment where employees could challenge leadership without fear, where honesty was currency, not a crime. People who had been beaten down by years of corporate games suddenly felt alive again, and productivity skyrocketed. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about proving a point to the world, and to myself, that being too honest isn't a weakness, it's a weapon. One day, during a company-wide meeting, an employee timidly raised her hand and said, "I heard what they did to you years ago. Why come back? Why buy this place after all that?" I smiled, and I told her the truth, because this company didn't need another liar. It needed someone unafraid to say what's real, even when it hurts. That moment sealed everything. I realized that my firing wasn't the end of my story, was the necessary beginning. They had tried to bury me, but in the process, they planted me, and 3 years later, I grew into the very storm they could never control. So if you're listening to this and you've ever been told you're too much, too loud, or too honest, remember my story. What they think is your flaw might be your fire. They fired me for being too honest. 3 years later, I bought the company. And let me tell you, honesty never felt so profitable, so powerful, and so beautifully sweet.